But as Katie mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about startup and corporate engagement, primarily ways to also avoid any pitfalls and really make that relationship productive for you, understanding some of the goals and how to get you there. So just putting a framing on it. This is obviously, like all of our other sessions during the core curriculum, more of an introduction. So there will be stuff here that some of you know just through your engagements and you've come to learn. So bear with me through that part. I think the goal is to get everybody on the same page so that when we have conversations, follow-up conversations in the future, all of this knowledge is basic and known to everyone. And as Katie also mentioned, super excited to have Zach Sun joining us. Most of you would not know him now that I'm realizing, as he was back from cohort 2016, I think. Zach, correct me if I'm wrong when we loop back with you. So what we'll do today is, there we go. We'll start off with about 30 to 35 minutes with some stuff that I will talk about, setting the stage, and then we'll get to the fun part, which is Zach chatting with you guys a little bit about his work at Tierra, specifically through the lens of reaching out to corporate partners, what came of those relationships, how did those factor into his development, and what he came to learn about his company and what path they took as a result of that. So looking forward to it. Let's jump right in then. So when we look at corporates, it's sort of a very broad term, but what can this group of industry players really do for you? Let's call out a couple of ways. So they can provide market information for you that you otherwise don't have access to. They can be an access to customers where it's particularly hard to break in or get the attention of a customer. They provide financial and technical resources that could be paying for a project, that could be providing technical engineering resources. Later on, as you go to scale up, they could be the people who are doing most of this. They're designing the plant, they're providing technical resources, and even some of the money, and you're really bringing the core technology and the idea. Partnering in your go-to-market execution comes down to scale up, as well as working together to deploy on a customer site and that sort of stuff. Lastly, of course, I think that what's implicit in all of this is that they're really adding legitimacy to your effort. When you partner with a GE or you partner with a Dow or another market player that is well known to your customer, that adds a sense of legitimacy to what you're doing. The other element of this is also around funding, right? As you go out and raise venture capital, even if you go out and raise grants, right? There's something that you can point to that says, what I'm doing is real and it exists in the world. So all of these are generally positive, and the goal is to try and help the relationship work for you. Now, what are a couple of steps along the way? So you could have a purchase order, which is traditionally in a large company, a path through procurement where they're able to transfer some funds to you for some services or for some products or deliverables provided. This is generally used for invoicing and for payment along the supply chain. But this is one way in which we've seen a lot of startups engage with their partners. Some of you may have already done this. You could use a SIPA, which I'll be talking about in a bit, but it's sort of structurally similar. It's an early stage contractual engagement where for a little bit of money, you're providing some collaboration and some other work. You would go to a full-on joint development agreement. This is a much more sort of mature engagement where it is a commercial engagement. You are co-developing some new concept, technology, product, and you're also stipulating on some of the commercial outcomes. So who is sharing revenue coming out of that? How is that relationship to be governed? Who has rights to customers and all of that? A joint venture, not all of you may need to worry too much about a joint venture. It's essentially a legal and financial construct where two companies, which remain separate, go in together from an investment and a resources perspective to sort of launch a venture together, as the name would suggest, thereby protecting each other in terms of liability. This is particularly common in the chemical space. So if you're in chemicals, it would do well to read up a little bit on that and hear about how that interaction takes place. Lastly, I'll mention corporate venture capital. This, I think I would put in a separate bucket. In all honesty, many of you will not necessarily be dealing with corporate venture capital from the perspective of investment, certainly not in the very short term. And I'll explain a little bit why. But they're another group in this area to think about, and perhaps later on the investment is something to consider. Lastly, of course, acquisition. I think just given the space that many of you are, certainly you see yourself as an independent company now, but as you develop, acquisition may very well be a possibility and an end goal for you as you look to launch your technology into the world. So what does this process of engagement really look like? You start with business development. Basically, let's meet, let's get a sense for if there's any overlap in what we're doing. You get to a stage where you may sign a non-disclosure agreement, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec, where you'd like to share a little bit more about use cases on both sides. And then you get to a point where you're trying to make a decision on, yes, there's enough here that we'd like to work on this together, and you'd like to proceed post that. At that point, you launch into some sort of early project engagement to really identify risks and to get a sense of like, what's stopping us from really launching into something larger? Is there something here that's more tangible that we can build on? And the last thing is, of course, really writing that home and going ahead and either co-developing something, launching a joint venture of some kind, or other commercial partnership, perhaps in collaboration with one of their customers or one of your customers. So who are they? So who are the corporates? Let's break that down for a second, and why do they care? Let's look at some of the groups within large companies and what their interests are in this whole engagement process. There's R&D groups, which are really looking at intellectual property coming from new technologies in target areas. And they may engage with you through co-development or joint development agreements or something like that. But their goal really is less product focused, right? They're not engaging as much with customers. They're really looking at fundamentally new technologies, how that may be the start of a new product line or a new concept for their company. They may be good to work with on technical de-risking, right? Because that's really where they live. Product groups are exactly focused on customers. They're looking at new capabilities, new market capture. So they may be very good to engage with around what does a customer really want? What are some of the offerings today, and how do they differ with what would be ideally available? And so learning about that from them would be valuable. Innovation groups, I'll talk about two broad varieties. One are sort of localized groups that are perhaps living within business units. I think they tend to be quite actionable and great contacts to have. They're a little bit more tied into the resources. While having often their own protected budgets to do projects, they also have enough of know-how and connections within those groups to make something tangible happen. Horizontal groups, so these will vary. There are some groups that sort of have top-down legitimacy from the CTO or the CEO, and they're sort of given the mandate of go innovate. Now that can turn out, as you can imagine, in two ways. Sometimes they're super successful at what they do, and they're staffed by people either coming previously core from the business units in order to continue that collaboration and bring in new ideas across the company. But it's also possible that they are sort of satellite organizations that are sitting in Silicon Valley, for example, that have been mandated to innovate. And it's not always clear what that is, perhaps. They may be a little bit sort of like a moon to the earth. They don't necessarily have the type of reach you may need to get the resources. So if you're engaging with a quote unquote innovation group, I would keep that in mind. Lastly, of course, I mentioned corporate venture capital. It's important to mention that corporate venture capital traditionally looks at financial upside. That's really why they're investing. They often do have a strategic element to what they do, as Robert touched on a little bit. And sometimes the corporate venture capital groups will sit within a larger innovation or larger venture organization. So from a mapping perspective, it's good to keep in mind. So now that we know a little bit of who we're dealing with and what your end goal could be, there are a range of things you could be looking at. what do you need to know going in, right? What do you need to know about yourself as you're going into the business development process, as you're meeting with people? Big question is, what do you need in a partner? You may be in chemicals or in electronics, but just because your partner is in chemicals or electronics does not mean you need to be working together. And that question comes down to, what do you need? Do you need a manufacturing partner? Do you in fact need an access to customer or some data about the market that you're trying to finesse and try to get a better sense of? Do you need a scale-up partner? You have your technology and you're raring to go, but you can't do a lot of what needs to be delivered on site. So you need somebody to provide that knowledge, expertise, and perhaps the resources. What specific resource and knowledge gaps are you looking to fill while making an engagement worthwhile? You have to know this, at least in the short term, right? What is it that in the next 2 years you want to accomplish? And what is it in terms of knowledge or whatnot that you don't think you can accomplish and you need someone externally to help you with that? And lastly, what's really, really important in all of this is, what are you willing to give in exchange in the relationship? Because this is a give and take, right? You need to make this work for you, but at the end of the day, there's someone sitting on the other side of the equation that needs something as well. And so whether it's exclusivity in a given market for a certain period of time, doing some work while not being paid for that work initially to develop that relationship, working on developing certain IP together, perhaps, which is not core to your business. Like, thinking about some of those trade-offs early on is actually quite critical, because when you have to answer those questions, it's best if you're not fumbling and sort of unclear on that. Next step would be actually finding your contact. What's really important in all of this is that your success in these engagements will really heavily depend on an internal champion. They may not be your only contact, but that is where your primary person who's putting sort of their political capital on the line to help you work through this and get the right contacts and put perhaps some resources towards that. Where might your ideal contact reside? We went over all of those groups. It really will depend on what you need. But generally what you'll want to look for is a decision maker of some kind. So you want someone who has access to a budget, access to the ability to sign off on some contracts, certainly be able to sign a non-disclosure agreement when you get to that point. And so what you need to be doing through this whole process, I think, is to be asking a lot of questions of anyone you meet. Network across the company. Just because you met someone at Samsung, taking sort of the metaphor of the elephant, like the elephant, you see one big behemoth, but in reality, there are the legs, there's the tail, there's the ears, and they all function in some ways together, but they're really addressing different parts of the operation. So continue to know as many people in the organization, and through that, you'll get a sense of like, who is it that seems most useful and is able to deliver on what you're really looking for up front. It's helpful, as I said, when you're interacting with different groups. There's some groups, so the R&D team, you may be developing technical buy-in. On the other side, you may be engaging with the C-suite because you need sort of top-down political coverage and resources to help you do what you need to do. The last point would be to ask a lot of questions again about like, have they done these sorts of engagements before? What have been the results of those? How many have they done? That tells you, do they have a budget, or are they asking every time for 50K? Which means that could easily take a couple of years, or beyond a year, in order to actually get that off the ground. What are their strategic priorities? Is what you're doing a huge revenue driver for them, or is it fifth on the list, and that may not be super interesting? And if it is fifth on the list, maybe it is something that they're looking to put more time into. So understand some of those dynamics. All right, now you've gotten to the non-disclosure agreement. And so the non-disclosure agreement, for those who may not be specifically familiar with that term, it is a contractual agreement between two parties where you're agreeing on confidentiality on certain types of information over a certain period of time, so that you can share information on use cases, on information that you both are working on, with the goal of finding some commonality to set the basis for future engagement of some kind. What I will say is, we've seen this across most of our teams. Please, please, please do not let signing an NDA paralyze you. The non-disclosure agreement in most industries is a convention. They usually have boilerplate information. It's important to read and carefully look at the NDA, but don't let it paralyze you. I would think about this as sort of a contractual, even a social agreement in many ways that allows, for example, in large companies, for them to be able to say, yeah, we've signed an NDA with them, you know, let's get the big folks in the office together. This is now a priority for us. We'd like to discuss with this startup what we can do. Without that, sometimes those things won't trigger. If you're worried about what information now you have to disclose, know that you still have the power on what you can disclose. Many times you will sign an NDA, and if you're not feeling, you know, good about the relationship, that it's totally on you. You don't have to disclose everything, right? This is about setting a precedent and a sense of trust, or building that sense of trust. And what's important to know on the corporate side, they actually have huge downsides to breaching these terms, right? I know in our community, we may hear about, you know, a startup being taken for a ride or whatnot, but in reality, that's a really, really small percentage of what happens. And the reality is that corporates have a huge downside in breaching those terms because of the reputations of their own reputations, right? These are sometimes 50, 100-year-old companies, and there are downsides to them breaching those terms. Some tips. So let's pause at this point. You've gotten to a point where you're getting a sense of interest on their side, and you're developing a relationship and developing some trust with an internal partner, internal champion, perhaps. It's important to know that corporates will often not give you a firm no. It has to do with the dynamics within the organization. It has to do with perhaps even, you know, the personalities of people who join large companies, and the fact that there is a chain of command, and the fact that they may be genuinely interested in what you're doing, but they may not be the best person to take it forward. So read the signs. Is your internal champion, you know, happy to receive updates, but they're not necessarily promising much in return. They're super psyched, but they can't deliver the goods when you're asking about a meeting or about moving a project forward. Like I said, connection to a high-level decision maker, even if it's not your only one, can be helpful and key to this. Innovation groups are not always connected to the right relevant group. So this goes back to the caveat I was mentioning about different innovation groups. If they are in fact a satellite office sitting in Silicon Valley, understand what their purview is. And that may not be the best source to get connections directly to very, very specific product groups, for example. They may not have the experience or the blueprint to engage quickly the way you need. That comes more down to perhaps experience. But again, if it's a satellite organization, they may not have that form of engagement that you need at any given point. All right. So now that you've perhaps signed an NDA and you're looking at whether or not we should work together on a broader engagement, what's really the next step now? You get to a point where, remember those goals that we had at the beginning, where you're talking about, let's partner to jointly develop an innovation and take something to market, you know, the joint development agreement, the joint venture, other commercial relationships. But between that and where you are now, there's like this deep chasm of like 6 to 18 months where you're asking a whole bunch of questions. These could relate to what should you work on together specifically, what form could that take, who owns the IP, who owns background IP on all of this, what are commercial terms, royalties, you know, you start getting into a whole bunch of questions. You're like, I honestly can't answer all of those questions right now. And you would be right. There are a lot of projects and engagement, I would argue, that sort of fall to the wayside during this period because you're trying to put the cart before the horse and answer more questions than what you really have access to at this point. So what you'd like to do in this really is to really downsize the number of questions. So coming back to the question of the SIPA and early project engagement. So what you would rather like to do is say, let's not rush into a full collaboration, a full commercial engagement, but let's break that down, take a bite-sized piece first. What are the risks involved here? Like, what is it that your corporate partner would like to know about what you can do? in a certain context that you'd like to get on the table first and say, yes, I can do this. And after that, let's start answering the broader questions. Let's focus on what work would you like to do together, like what form will the project take? What resources can both teams provide? How many people can you as a startup put towards this? Can the corporate partner provide engineering time, some cost towards the project, so some strategic deliverables from their side. And the last question would be, once you've actually completed that sort of a project, put a tail into that engagement that really asks the question, do you want to spend more time answering this? Say this goes well. What is, broadly start talking about what are the next steps? If you reach the milestones that you're expected to, is it that you go and sign a joint development agreement or begin those discussions? Is the end goal actually where they say, oh, this is super interesting. We'd actually like to toss you over to our corporate venture capital group because they're actually looking at investing in these types of technologies. You have some time. What you're doing is you're giving yourself the ability to access resources and move your technology and effort forward while not sort of smothering the possibility of broader engagement. And you're also tuning the interpersonal and inter-organizational fit and getting a sense of how it will be to work with this organization in the long term, and you're doing so in a smaller amount of time. To that end, what I'll just close with is that our organization sat on this for a while, and about 2 years ago, we came out with SIPA, which is the Simple Partnership Agreement Templates, which are two contractual early project engagements. The SIPA quote is roughly built like a purchase order document, while the Simple Service Agreement is a more standard services-oriented collaboration document. Now, both of them can be used for any one engagement. We've seen people use them separately. We've seen them use them in tandem or in series. But the goal is really that these documents are a starting point which have, warranties, the general scope of work, putting down agreements on both sides on what the deliverables are, and frames those early engagements. A number of our teams and alumni have used these, so please do reach out in the All Fellows channel if you're curious about that. I'm also happy to point you in the direction. But consider these a tool along with other things you'll be receiving through the fellowship, and find time with Matt, myself, other folks on the team to get a rundown on how this could be helpful for you as you're getting to that process. Really quickly, I would say if you put a set of metrics on what a SIPA project could look like, the deliverables could be a range of things, right? It could be reports of some kind. It could be data coming from testing. Could be some sort of a presentation on your findings or samples of some kind. So that will vary. But the budgets, if you look at it, it can be from tens of thousands to a couple $100,000, not much more than that. And from a time frame perspective, you're looking at 3 to 12 months of concrete project work. This is not like a multi-year engagement. This is really trying to set the basis for what could be a valuable relationship going forward. So with that, I will pause my my blabbering, and we'll go to Zach. So I'll stop my share so that we can see each other. And we'll pause for Q&A shortly, but I think it would be great to get Zach and quickly have him introduced.
Great. Sure. I can introduce myself or.
Yeah, I would just say, yeah. So Zach is from our second cohort, I think, for 2016, and was Sindri Turbai when I knew him, but Tierra Biosciences is their company, and they're looking at basically extracellular protein development, if that's correct. And so with that, I'll hand it off to you, Zach, for a quick intro on yourself, and then I have a couple of questions we can walk through.
Sure. Okay. Sounds good. Well, so first off, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to see so many new faces. Crazy how the program has grown. So my name is Zach again, cohort 2 or cohort 2016. Tierra Biosciences is a company. We're looking to produce a non-demand protein expression platform to drive kind of biotech innovation. very much a platform kind of company. Started in 2015, went through CR, and then we raised a 2.6 venture round shortly thereafter. We've done like $1 million of commercial revenue, and then like, I don't know, 6 million of grants, somewhere like that. Who knows? So lots of grants. Yeah, my background is I'm a synthetic biologist, bioengineer by training. Kind of done the single founder, so kind of learned things as I went. Our corporate engagement has been very similar. I think we've kind of learned as we've gone. So happy to share any feedback that at least I've glanced from before. But yeah, I guess Nikhil, do you want to start with questions, or should I'm happy to go over how the company has leveraged corporate engagements?
Yeah, I would jump right into that. Basically, like how is it factored into your development? What is it added perhaps to your knowledge? And what was that process like?
Sure. Okay. So why don't I'm going to share you. I think it'd be useful to see how we've looked at corporate developments. This is our pitch deck, but there's really 2 slides here that I'll focus on. Pitch deck starts with an idea, says what's the technology, and then says like what traction is there against it. And so, for us, the corporate developments have really played into this deck and kind of how we draft narrative, which is that our technology has been technically de-risked, just protected. We've put in grant money to de-risk it, but we've also been able to show that it's valuable. There's product market fit by our corporate engagements, which is this slide here. So these are kind of all the engagements that we've done to date with the windows in which we've done them. They kind of cross different fields, right? But I think the key here is that for us, corporate engagements have been a way that we're able to say, look, our technology, we've been able to de-risk it with people that are willing to pay money to try it out. And then furthermore, because they do multiple phases of work with us, that it indicates that it's useful because we move on to like additional engagements. And so this kind of indicates that in the process of building technology, we'll demonstrate it that has utility across these certain fields. And therefore, right, it de-risks the technology to a certain extent. So that's kind of how we've looked at them. Our corporate engagements have all been done on purchase orders. So I think Nikhil, one of a really good kind of different types of engagements that you can engage in. For us, purchase orders have been the easiest way to do things because the engagements are meant to kind of de-risk technology in a certain space. So that's how they've all been structured. But yeah, so that's kind of how, when we look at it, I think corporate engagements can take all different types of like levels. For us, it's really technology de-risking and demonstrating product market fit, and for investors, right, to say, look, there's something here that's not just supported by grant money. Or an idea from the lab.
And we have a question from Amy.
Sure.
Hi, Zach. Thanks so much for joining. How did you think about setting pricing for these corporate engagements, and are you able to make a profit off of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So profit is an interesting term. If you look at the engagement purely from we've signed the engagement, we're doing the work, and I will deliver the deliverable, we're definitely making boatloads of money on them. If you look at the engagement from the amount of time it's gone into actually getting the engagement, we are definitely not making any money on them. So I think there's 2 ways to look at that. In terms of pricing, so these are purchase orders, which are meant to be simple. A typical purchase order is not going to cover much more than $500,000. I think what you'll find when you find that internal champion, it's to the internal champion, generally the internal champion's interest to find something that works. And typically the number is going to be the number that they can sign off on. Right. So the question that we like to ask, or we learn to ask, is effectively, well, what would you like to do? And then what is, what's the limit upon which you would need other approval to get another project done? And you'll typically get a range, right? And then from there, that kind of dictates where you go. I'll say, of course, every field is different, right? My field is biotech, but our pricing, we've got agreements on the lowest end has been $50K, and the highest end has been around $300K per agreement. So that's a range for what these PO things have done. But yeah, that answers your question.
I actually have a quick follow on.
Sure.
So for POs, as I mentioned earlier, it's basically the large company's way of procuring some products or something that they're buying. And so when purchasing something, presumably there's some terms in there that says, they own a lot of what they are purchasing just by that transaction. So are there ways in which you modify those modify those documents and/or think about what terms to quickly look out for to ensure that it's a smooth process for you and that you're not sort of giving away anything in the process, given that this is for you not just selling a product, but actually
Right.
trying to de-risk your technology.
Right. Yeah. So POs are, let me tell you a story. So our first engagement was actually set up by Psychotron Road. So I will say CR is a great place to find in corporate engagements because you guys are visited constantly by innovation leads, which are literally paid to form corporate engagements. So that's great. Our first agreement was, it was kind of like new uncharted territory, right? We didn't really know what we were doing. My background's technology, so I was kind of relying a lot on Matt and Nikhil to help me guide through. But the process kind of, as I've seen kind of now, more than 5 agreements we've done, it pretty much flows the same way, which is you have an introduction to the group, you go to a sponsor or an advocate, you convince them that what you're doing is really interesting. They want to learn more, you sign an NDA. From there, you discuss the scope of work that formalizes into a PO, and then a PO is negotiated and then signed, and the project starts. The whole process, fastest we've seen it go is 6 months, can typically take even a year or more. So this is not a short process. In terms of kind of the pitfalls, if you kind of think of it from the start to the back, when you start that conversation, right, if they want to learn more, you typically want to sign an NDA. I think that's something that can be scary when you're thinking, oh, I might give away my technology, as Nikhil mentioned. But actually, it's a lot of work for the other side to sign an NDA. And now we've kind of taken the opposite approach, which is like, we want to get you to the point where you are signing an NDA, because when you sign an NDA, that indicates that the other side wants to learn more, right? They're willing to put in the effort to learn more. And so that I think used to be something that we thought was scary, but now we think is, that's actually a good thing that we push for. In NDA, I've heard multiple things. I've heard legal counsel say, if you're really worried, you can sign a one-way NDA where only you share confidential information to the other party. So that way there's never a question of whether there was a mix-up of IP, if you're very worried about that. But, we typically just sign what they have because it's almost always off a standard template from the other side. The second part, I think, then goes into the actual PO. It's useful to kind of, right, you have an advocate for a reason. The advocate is there to make it work. The internal politics of every organization is different, and understanding what that politics looks like between who approves things, between where money flows, right, is really important, between how the money, even like what kind of funds the money is coming out of. Because that kind of dictates what you can and can't do with the structure, right? Because effectively, the advocate wants to work with you, but the advocate has to work within the confines of the company. And that company may, for example, like have a PO that is completely not editable, but you can add writers to, right? So that we've seen that in one case. So effectively what we've been told, add a writer that says all this part is not approved and we want this to be the case, and the writer overtakes the PO. Right, which is just as good as editing the PO, but it will get through legal, right, or corporate in a way that like the PO edit wouldn't, right? Other groups are okay with editing the PO, right? Other groups are okay with using simplified forms, although we haven't met many that are okay with that to date. So I think there's kind of different levels, but it's really you need to work with your advocate to figure that out. I'll share. I have a very heavily redacted PO, so I'm just going to share this so you guys can see. Okay, great. So your typical PO form, right, is going to be they'll call them different things: research services agreement, purchase order, allocation of rights agreement. They can take different forms, right? But usually the corporate will have a document like this that they'll give to you to sign. The main thing you want to look out for is the IP clause. Which in this case, I mean, you'll quickly find it. Here's where it reads. Okay, I blocked it off. Great. So this area here would effectively say this corporate owns everything that's done in this project, right? And as a PO, because they're paying you, that's fairly standard if you're actually just like doing a service, right? But right, we're able to get this added, this language here. If you read it, provider shall retain ownership or control of all intellectual property owned or licensed by provider prior to effective date. And this is key, or that is conceived, developed, or reduced to practice during the term of this agreement that is unrelated to the services, blah, 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 right? So that's an example, right, where the PO doesn't have to be edited very much to just say, look, if it's my technology, right, and I'm improving on my technology, then I'm going to own that, and that's going to be crystal clear from this document, right? So I think there are ways that, you know, these documents that look scary. POs are typically short, which is nice, but you can add things to them, right, to kind of protect your interests. And many times it's understood, right? Like if you're an advocate, if you're trying to protect your own technology, the other side understands this, right? And so like these are things that like on principle, you figure out in principle what you guys want to protect, and then you carve it into the agreement as needed. Not sure if that answers the question as well, but.
Thanks. So we
great.
have a couple of questions from fellows. So the first is from Tom Mahoney.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. So my question is, you know, you said early on that you think of these agreements as kind of a strategy towards attracting additional investment from venture capitalists. And then thinking about, you know, Amy's question of like, is it actually profitable for you guys, these agreements? Zooming out more, like, has it worked out that, you know, spending the time to develop these agreements has actually allowed you to raise venture capital in a way that you thought that the time investment was worth it? And then if so, like, do you have a sense for like when is sort of the ideal time to start these agreements or think about, you know, putting them into practice?
No, that's a good question. So again, I think it's a highly personal decision based on what your business model is, right? So it's really hard to divorce the should you do corporate engagements with what is your business model. So for us, we're very much a platform technology, right? We want to provide services of multiple verticals. And so in that case, the agreements are really helpful, right? To push, you know, the technology forward. If you're making a product and your product is like very unique and you know, you might not want to use our purchase order type thing, right? It just depends on kind of where you're going with that. In terms of the cost of doing these agreements, it's not necessarily in the, I think if you, I will say for us, then a lot of our initial costs were just the manpower that we'd need to actually identify the people and then kind of funnel into the right organization. For every one agreement you sign, there's probably 10 outbounds, right, that you do. So for us, it was a cost of a business development lead that we had on payroll, right, to really push these agreements forward. So that it's more like a acquisition cost, right, more than a execution cost that we were incurring. Now, you know, whether that's sustainable from a company perspective, right? Business development, getting purchase orders looks very much like a consulting type business, right? Which is not what we wanted to build. And so, I mean, we've kind of switched our model actually recently to do a B2B type business where we have like an online portal that you can order things from. But the real goal of that is really just to get Global 2000 customers to order so we don't have to do acquisition costs anymore and then kind of funnel them into our purchase orders accordingly. So that's one way that we're kind of taking the model that we used to have and kind of tilting it to make it a bit more profitable, I would say. But in terms of kind of, you know, we always saw these as ways to get investor interest and, again, technology de-risking. So I think that's kind of posed very well, right? To be able to say that we have grants that build technology and then people that pay for it, I think instantly resolves the, well, does this work? Is there product market fit? And I would say for us too, by doing these projects, we've understood way better how our technology can apply in a corporate setting in a way that we would never get insight on otherwise, be it from like conversations or from grants or whatnot. So I think there's a lot of benefits that accrue there, not just money.
Thanks.
And our next question is from Grayson.
Yeah, thanks for coming. It was interesting to hear you say that you had hired like a BD person to do this full time on the acquisition side. And I think something that we've been thinking about, like you said, these are like custom bespoke deals, and 6 months is a ton of time to convert one. So have you made any progress in like processing this? Like, and is that based on where you come in the org? Is it based on your agreements and pricing? Like, how do you spin up that wheel so that these all aren't custom 6-month closing times?
Right. That's a good question. I think, well, it's in the same way that after you do something multiple times, you start to see the patterns that kind of flow. I think we're seeing that. So the process every time goes faster and faster. So I would say in short that's what we're expecting. Our thesis, right, to be clear right now, is that if we can, instead of hiring a BD lead and gaining these agreements, use instead marketing power, right, so that we skip the acquisition phase, we think
Mhm.
that that would make it more effective. So that's kind of our current thesis. When it plays out, we'll see. But yeah, I guess in terms of kind of short circuiting this the process, I mean, again, it's pattern recognition, right? So like for us, we saw innovation leads were really key. You want to take an innovation lead, get them excited, have them connect you inwards to the organization. That for us has been way more effective than trying to inbound to scientists or our final customers,
Mm.
right? So the innovation lead has been almost in every scenario key to our success. Now, how you get to the innovation lead is interesting, right? Because we've had CR used to be our intro source for all innovation leads, which was great. Then we started getting conferences, going to conferences and meeting innovation leads. Recently, we've gotten innovation leads from just our marketing, right? And so that's been helpful. And so I think, you just start to see patterns kind of flow out from it. Yeah, I would say that's probably the case. Like in these big orgs, it's hard to find the right person, right? And I think that's what can cost a lot of money. And if you have a BD person like shooting arrows every which way, you'll hit the right person eventually, right? But that might be much more expensive than like a targeted kind of search.
So it's 6 months, like
Uh-huh.
a lot of that is just getting them into the top of the funnel by finding the right person, not like from first contact.
Oh no, it's even from first contact onwards, right? It still takes a long time to define the project. Because a lot of our most fruitful projects have been where they have to make a case internally to say, can
Mhm.
I want to fund this, right? Because this is good for my org, but also good for another group of this org, right? In a Global 2000 company, you've got to make a case that it's innovation, not just across your group, but also other groups. That takes time, right? They're doing the same process that you're doing to them, which is trying to build support for your project. And so 6 months is a pretty valid concern. And another project that we just signed, right, was with a group that had never done any bio type projects. And so the full 6 months was literally working with their legal to get comfortable with what a biology agreement looks like, right? And so that's yet another kind of, so I think you err on the side of these take longer than you would expect or want.
Thank you.
And Grayson, I would quickly add too that just even when we as Activate engage with companies, right, that this whole concept of like them needing to build a case internally, that's like very, very familiar. So
Right.
they're trying to look at like, how does this fit into our portfolio? Is this exciting? There are 5 other ideas knocking on the door. How do we fit it together? And so it comes back down to your champion, right? Is that person someone who can, at least over that time, make that case?
I would say like most times I think the motives are pure, with the exception of maybe Google X. Most times the motives are pure, but right. So like I think being like really it's very hard I think to get something moving unless you can work really well with your advocate, and you'll know, right, if your advocate's like sharing information, is like really like trying to get something to work, right? You'll know the difference between that and just like what effectively is like a pump for information, right? Like not wanting to move forward, kind of like trying to delay things. Like you can tell the difference pretty easily. It should feel right.
I'm curious, Zach. I think we didn't talk about this, but I was curious. Occasionally, that champion is really critical in all of this, but occasionally that person will leave as a result of a transfer, as a result of leaving the company, a change in the organization. What have you seen that happen?
Oh yeah, we've seen it happen all the time. Yeah.
And
So yeah, that's a really good question. So we had one purchase order that was a 3-part project where there are collaborators in front of us, and what we learned later is that the collaborators were delayed, so that delayed us on and on and on. What happened actually was that once we got started, the central org decided to lay off the whole group, and so our project it just barely started, but started to float a little bit in oblivion. When that happens, it can be pretty challenging, right? For us, how we've tried to recover that is say, okay, look, I've got my advocate, but I've also got my innovation lead, right? It's been a process of having my advocate transition the project to a new advocate, trying to bring the new advocate on board, which is challenging, right? Because the new advocate's kind of taking this thing that someone else is championing, and then having my innovation lead in the back, right, kind of talking to him, saying, oh, look, this is what happened, this is why I think it's so valuable, can you give me some information as to like where this person sees this project fits, right? And so I think this is where having all these ties into the org are really important, because every person serves a different purpose, right? The innovation lead is really, the goal for them is to be able to show that technology works across many levels. So they're very much like, can we get projects across different groups, which we have, right? Whereas a scientist now that takes over the project, right, they're probably incentivized to just wrap it, right, and make sure that it goes okay. And so aligning interests, I think, is important there. But you'll see that very commonly, right? And the warning signs of it too, which is like, you know, oh, we might not have money for R&D next year because our profits were too low, or like they're doing a restructuring, or like my boss is leaving, right? These are all good warning signs that, oh, you might see a shakeup.
I mean, I think there are other cases also where, like, in all honesty, one of our teams has been doing a collaboration or trying to set up one, and that person leaves as a result of something. I forget exactly what. And in that case, that particular engagement just did not go forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because perhaps the person who comes in has a political interest in sort of resetting all of the strategic outlook for the company and stuff like that. And so it's important to know that, like, don't put all of your eggs in one basket, like, until the contract is signed. And even once it's signed and you're in the middle of doing that work,
Mm-hmm.
it's not a guarantee that
Yes.
that's going to go through the way you expect.
That's right. Yeah, that's a really important thing to think about. So I'm just getting my charger. Yeah, that's a really important point. It's not, there's no guarantee until you actually get the money in the bank. So the other thing actually to think about with POs is that, at least in the POs, I don't know about the other areas, is that many times you get paid in the rear. It's normally get paid in the rear as opposed to purely paid in the front, right? So this becomes a working capital issue too, right? So not only are you signing the agreement, it takes 6 months, but after you sign it, it might take you 6 months to do the work. An agreement might read like, we'll pay you X up front, but we'll pay you Y afterwards, right? And so having the working capital to pretty much front some of the money, and then, you know, wait 60 days after you file an invoice to get the money in is another thing, right? Because it doesn't really reflect on your books if you're accrual until you actually put the invoice out, right? Which, depending on your contract, might say something different. So that's something to think about, right? Working capital would be very important in that case. You can also negotiate those terms if it is an issue for you. So yeah. And there's a little more nuances too, right? Like for us, like if you do some of these POs at risk, you might get like R&D tax credits for the work that you do. There's like ways you can play with that. There's a lot of like little things you can play with these things.
Zach, if there are no other questions, I had a follow-on question.
Yeah.
As you're looking at the engagements that you went and pursued, there's a question, whether it's grants or industrial engagements, there's this question of how core is the work that is being proposed to what I want to do and what I need to accomplish technically or
right.
perspective in the next 2 years.
Yeah.
Was there an example of that where you had to make that call?
Yeah.
And how did that thought process work?
That's a good question. So I would say early on in the company, we weren't very picky. We kind of just signed whatever and whenever. Part of that came to bite us in the butt. I will say one of our first corporate engagements, we were kind of, okay, well, let's just do something to get something on the books. And it very quickly became clear that like our technology probably wouldn't fit their use case. I think if I got that agreement today, I don't think I would have done it, right? So now the question is like, how do you learn that, right? For us, a lot of it has been just learning by doing, right? And so if we hadn't done the agreement, it'd be hard to know that it really didn't fit like what that market needed. So I would say alignment, you know, I think is partially, you know, can you say beforehand, oh yeah, I think this aligns to what my technology needs to build to or what my commercial or investment needs are, right? But secondly, you also learn a lot from doing the agreement, whether you're aligned or not, which is something that we've seen in subsequent agreements. Many of the market ideas that like we've kind of pushed came from doing work with our corporate partners and saying, oh yeah, this is a really interesting area where we can play. So yeah.
Great, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it looks like Amy has another question.
Sure. I would just say, so I would say like, right, with government money, for those of you that write grants, like we've gotten more than 10 grants on SBIRs and et cetera. But the key, I think, with government money is that you are almost always proposing what to do, then they feed you money to do it. But there isn't actually someone is willing to pay you to do something that they need, right? The definition of a corporate engagement is that someone will pay you money to do something that they need, which indicates product market fit in a way that government money will never give you. So I think that's why they're really important, at least for us to do in parallel with government money, which, you know, you could consider dumb money, let's call it that, right? Which is going to give you the actual money you need to build the technology, but may not give you the place to point it. So yeah, sorry, Amy, didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no worries. Sounds like you didn't have any issues negotiating who owns the IP. Did you have to struggle with that to kind of get to a place where you could just dictate those IP terms?
We heavily struggled with that, actually. So in our first engagement, I think this is a trial by fire. So in our first engagement, what we said was, here's a PO, but we're going to file IP that says we own this set of things. But we didn't have like the, look, whatever we develop, that's ours, or belongs to us kind of a statement. As a result of that agreement, what actually happened was in the process of doing work, we did develop IP on our side, but since we used the materials from the other side to identify that IP, it got super cloudy, right? And that became super complicated. What we ended up doing was having to give them an indefinite license to the IP that we filed. That started a learning process to say, okay, how do you do this appropriately the next time, the next time, the next time? I think it very much is like a learning kind of experience, right? For us, what we're asking for is typically we want IP on the things that we developed internally on our platform, and we don't want to contaminate it with what you have. But whatever you give us, you own, right? That's a pretty easy line, I think, in a SAN to draw. And so we've been able to program those into our POs respectively since our first agreement. With that said, if you're more like, okay, this is really a joint thing and we want to jointly own what comes out of it, then it becomes a more complicated discussion point, right? And you want to get alignment with the person you're working with before you go into signing one of these. I would say of POs, IP is the biggest issue, right? It's really figuring out how to get IP protections. POs are not built for that, right? So you're kind of hacking them. So I think that's kind of the biggest question mark that you want to try to fix. Our biggest point of contention.
I think we have time for probably one more question. Someone wants to jump in.
Zach, yeah, just following up on that last point. I agree. The sticky bits are always around IP, and just curious about, are you using your corporate counsel?
Yeah.
What mechanisms are you using, or what resources are you using to kind of navigate the intellectual property sharing issues that you face in your business, and do you think that can be generalized to everybody else here?
That's a great question. So again, the first agreement is the hardest. The first agreement, we definitely heavily leaned on our corporate counsel to craft the agreement. Now, when we see agreements, we typically look at them and then look at the IP clauses. And if they read something, or if we can get our standard language that we want into them, then we feel comfortable enough saying, okay, this works, we'll go with it, instead of having it caught up in corporate counsel, because you're going to spend $10K in corporate counsel if you're going to bounce it to them. But if you see an agreement that's like very, very strange, right, then I would bounce it to corporate counsel. So I think it depends on your comfort level, right? The more or the less you do, I think the more you get comfortable with the wording around these. So yeah, our recent case again was a group that didn't know bio, right? They're purely tech. And so for them, they said, okay, well, our legal needs to draft an agreement, or can you draft one? I told them, I'm not drafting one because that's going to cost a ton, but here are some templates that you can use. I give them like academic kind of IP agreement templates for their legal to then draft one for me. And then I took that to my legal and said, okay, based on this, can you edit this to protect what TR needs? So that's been another strategy, right? Inevitably, right, if you're the advocate on the corporate side, your legal is in-house, it's free. Our legal is really expensive, right? And so leveraging their free legal to do what you need to do also works.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to both Nikhil and to Zach for all the good information today. If people want to either do some digital applause or unmute themselves and do some real applause, I encourage that.
Great. No, thanks for having me.
And so, yeah, thank you guys both so much. And with that, we'll wrap up and we'll see all the fellows back here, same time, same place next week.
Hey guys, I have just one thing to add. I would just say that particularly as the CR partnerships manager, but even as we have support for partnerships in Boston, I would say as you look at this presentation and your mind is churning with potential partners in your mind, the best thing you can do is share some of those corporate targets with us so that we can go out and do some searching, look within our networks, and perhaps bring some of those introductions and meetings to you guys. So put some time into that if that's a priority for you, and it'll be a priority for us as a result. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Mikhail.